Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Brown, Senior Academic Officer at Southbridge Learning, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today's webinar. Today, we're going to be learning from Dr. Dawn Miller about how progress monitoring is an essential feature of effective multi-tier support. Dawn Miller works at the Swift Education Center at the University of Kansas. Swift is a national pre-K through 12 center that provides technical assistance and coaching at the state, regional, district, and site levels to promote the learning and academic achievement of all students. Prior to joining Swift, Dawn was the integrated MTSS facilitator for a school district near Kansas City. Dr. Miller served as a project director for statewide implementation of the problem-solving process, which evolved into the Kansas multi-tiered system of supports. During her career, she has worked as a special education teacher, a school psychologist, adjunct faculty member for administrative programs in Kansas, and district and building coach and trainer. Dr. Miller's research and scholarship focuses on the problem-solving process, assessing written language, and family communication and involvement. Dr. Miller will present for about 40 minutes, and then we will open up the discussion for questions and answers. So please feel free to submit questions for her to answer at the end of the presentation using the question box feature in the GoToWebinar control panel. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. Everyone's lines will be muted during the webinar today. If you have questions, again, please use the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you cannot get the internet audio option to work, it may be due to a firewall issue with your district. In that case, please choose the dial by phone option instead. Okay, Dawn, you can begin.
All right, Rachel, well, thank you. Well, welcome to everyone. It is a little different to do a webinar format where I can't see the faces and have the interaction live and in motion, but I'm really thrilled that there were many people interested in this topic that has been near and dear to my professional career and one that I love. So thank you. I have as norms today to engage as you can in a webinar. I hope that this will give you time to pause and reflect and think about the degree to which these practices are in place in your system, how they're working for you, or what they could look like. And I included another norm that says, I really hope you expect to walk away with at least one takeaway to share with others, or something that might be part of your particular practice in your role. When I was putting together the learning outcomes for this webinar on progress monitoring, I thought about it in the context of thinking about putting together an elevator speech. So being able to talk about progress monitoring, as Rachel said, in the context of a multi-tiered system of support, being able to think and articulate the why of progress monitoring, the what of progress monitoring, and then being able to reflect on how we put the data in action in a data routine. There was a recent blog that was kind of a companion to this webinar that I put the QR code for you to access through the FastBridge platform that might be something that would be a reference document or something that you could bring back to have as a read with a particular group of colleagues or as a department. But I'm going to keep referencing back to this notion of putting together an elevator speech about progress monitoring in these 4 areas. And I thought about it for an elevator speech because oftentimes we can be caught off guard, and people that might be new to the district, it might have been a new administrator or a new teacher or a parent, and they say, now, why are we doing that particular practice? And if we're caught off guard and we say, because we're supposed to, we immediately think that's really not the best answer that I could have given. So I thought that these 4 areas kind of anchored a way of thinking about the purpose and intent of progress monitoring. So we'll start with multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS, as the context. At the Swift Education Center, our tagline for MTSS is all students, one system and a continuum of support. And oftentimes states or districts or sites will have figured out what visual fits with them. And my intent is not to go through the particulars of our visual, but rather to use it as a way of thinking about progress monitoring in the context of what does that mean when we think about universal or oftentimes called tier one support, and that which we do for all students. How we think about data are used to be able to signify students who may need additional support and what the role of progress monitoring is there, and what progress monitoring means as we think about intensified support. And I'm hoping that we're able to put in the chat box and make available to you a link to what we affectionately call our placemat around a multi-tiered system of support. And I know there's a lot of
chat that out to folks. That should have popped up for folks. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. And if the link doesn't work, that's all on me and not on Rachel. And I'll make sure that you get it at a later time.
It looks like it's working, so I think you should be
perfect.
good.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for trying it out too. So my intent in showing this is to get people thinking about where do you see progress monitoring? And this is about a 25,000 feet above the ground look at a multi-tiered system of support and the components. And I would say that fairly universally, known by some other names sometimes, this is something that nationally people share in common, whether your state might call it these particular headlines or not. But these areas here of, oops, I tried to use the spotlight, one moment. Nope. The ones that have the bold header underneath of teams, data, evidence-based practices, and continuous improvement process, those four headers that you see across all the different areas of support, those we like to think of as the load-bearing walls. So a state or a site or a district might call it problem-solving process instead of continuous improvement, but usually by whatever name, these four pieces are part of what would define a multi-tiered system of support. So as you look at that, think about where you see the role of progress monitoring. And I'll give you just a moment there to do that. Oftentimes where people's eyes go immediately are the area where it says progress monitoring explicitly. So when we think about the role of data, it's explicitly said in the areas of additional or intensified, or what oftentimes people call tier 2 or tier 3. So spelling out the need to be able to define a progress monitoring system that will help us with decision making. Sometimes people have said, you know, it says universal screening over here for data, but when they think about how the data are used, they can see it in the context of it's a problem-solving process using data to look at school or grade level or department level or age level, depending upon your role and how you look at data. So I want to unpack that a little bit because I think it's an oftentimes unutilized the data routine is underutilized when it comes to universal support. So by whatever name, continuous improvement, plan, do, study, act, problem solving, whatever cycle of inquiry you use, let's think about that as a context for progress monitoring. So we might have a school at the beginning of the year look at students incoming in the fall, and they might say, you know, this paints a picture. We have, in this case, in literacy, we have 7% of students coming in the fall that have an indication on this measure of being at higher risk in the area of literacy. We have 18% of incoming first graders showing some risk, so they may need some additional support. We have 29% of students that appear on this measure to be low risk in the need, in the need for literacy support, And we have 46% that are coming in at what we would classify or as an advanced level, meaning that the universal support should be good to go for them to continue progress. We'd like the teams to be starting right away talking about, what does this make us think? What does this make us think in terms of our curriculum and scope and sequence and pacing guides? What does it make us think in terms of instructional strategies that we utilize to teach literacy? What does it make us think about when we think about our engagement routines that we're going to kick off in the fall? What does it make us think about with regard to the arrangements that we're going to use for literacy instruction, as well as the time that's allocated? From a progress monitoring sense, we'll be able to look at how are we doing in the winter when we have data on all of our students again. And in this case, the first grade team might be saying that things aren't working as maybe they were really hoping that it would be, and they need to revisit now what we know about this group of learners, what does it make us think about in terms of curriculum, instruction, engagement routines, arrangements, and time, so that we can make some mid-course adjustments as we think about first grade as a whole. And then as we end the year, we can be looking at how did we end the year and what does that make us think? And in this particular case, the first grade team really has some lessons learned that they should be saying, our experience with our first graders this year, what does this make us think as a first grade team about what our needs are? What are our needs when we think about curriculum, when we think about professional development, when we think about materials and time, etc., as we prepare for incoming first graders the next year? Likewise, these lessons learned and thinking about this as a progress monitoring tool at the grade level is to say, how do we share with our second grade colleagues, what did we learn that would be important for them as they think about these first graders becoming second graders and the use of the curricular materials, the use of the instructional strategies, etc. So that's the context in thinking about progress monitoring at a school level or a grade level for universal support. What about the context in MTSS for progress monitoring as it relates to those students we've identified as needing additional support and us doing that? We may be looking at groups of students, and I just grabbed 4 graphs, just don't pay attention to the details, but more for illustration, to say, when we look at groups of students receiving support, we might be able to get an indication of who's on track, for whom might we want to make a decision about lessening our supports, or we might want to think about maybe problem solving and making some adjustments to our intervention or instructional strategies. So for 2 of these students, and I know that the writing might be really small, but it looks like we have Susan here in the upper left, and we have Arthur in the lower right, for whom the team may have looked at it and said, you know what, it appears as though that we're well on track. We may be able to, in Arthur's case, really make the decision that that support is no longer necessary early on, and we can continue providing just universal support. And for Susan, it looks like we're really strong and steady and holding our own, that we might be able to lessen that support. For Lucille and for Patrick, it might give pause for concern for the team to say, what's working, what's not working as well, and what might we do to adjust? Not necessarily at the individual student level, but maybe at the group level, we might make some adjustments in terms of frequency or duration or the instructional strategy that we're doing. So at a group level, in additional support, we can really lean on that progress monitoring to help guide our efforts. And then where most people start thinking about progress monitoring, it's more in that individual student arena, where we think about monitoring individual student progress and being able to see if things are working well. So for this student, Jasmine, we have an indication of, okay, we're putting things in place. How is it working for us? We're getting that feedback system that lets us know, in this case, it appears like we have a good match, that we're on track, and we can kind of keep going until we have an indication otherwise. What's nice about the graph here is that we have an indication below of, in this case, words that were missed on this particular probe. That gives really nice diagnostic information to be able to take pause and say, do I see a pattern to particular errors that the student is missing? So while it's not intended to be a diagnostic assessment, we can gather diagnostic information from it, and we might be able to see that a lot of words with the suffix of ed on the end may be being approached the same way, and we might be able to do an easy correction for that. So MTSS as the context for progress monitoring, really important in terms of how it serves us at the school level or the grade level, group level, and individual student level. The second part of the elevator speech is being able to talk about our why. Why is progress monitoring practices important? What do they do for us? And I usually, when I'm with a group, I like to throw it out as a word cloud or use answer garden, because immediately people can start generating, why do we monitor student progress? And usually the bigger the word, the more often that particular response was given. So usually immediately people will say, that's a way for us to show effectiveness, or that gives us information to be able to adjust what we're doing, or that's how we make decisions. That's how we demonstrate growth. Yeah, some people that get into, I'm able to analyze student progress differently. It helps us with collaboration. It helps us know how to allocate resources, right? Very quickly, people come up with individual reasons why monitoring student progress is important. Sometimes what comes out here, and what I would hope people always lean on or lean into, is the fact that the research behind progress monitoring is really strong. And this was really nice for me to see validated in the literature. John Hattie's work has kind of been a book that is now tattered and torn on my shelf, actually right next to me. And when we saw formative evaluation in there as one of those that was really close to the very top of being one of the strongest practices in that book, it really said for all those years that we were promoting this, there was a reason behind it. And a lot of that work, I give my hat off to, or take my hat off to Lynn Fuchs and her colleagues at Vanderbilt for really pursuing and demonstrating a line of research that a lot of other people have been able to expand on. And that line of research was able to demonstrate for us that our purpose for progress monitoring was to give us feedback as to when we needed to stay the course or when we needed to make a change. So I hope that people always really brag about the fact that this is a really strong evidence-based practice. And in the Hattie summary, he summarizes from that when teachers use data and evidence-based models, the effect size is higher than when it's just judgment alone, and the fact that when those data are graphed and we have that visual representation, that's higher than when it's only recorded. So for the why, I like people to have kind of that immediate why it's important to them. I love it when we tag on the research. And then the last piece around the why I think is helpful is when people give an analogy. And groups that I've been with are so creative in coming up with great analogies for it. My favorite, and I apologize that I can no longer provide an adequate reference for this. If somebody out there knows where this originally came from, I'd very much appreciate being able to give credit where credit's due, because I've been using this now for a long time. But it immediately kind of connects people to how GPS systems are important for us in other arenas. When hunters are lost in the woods, when pilots are finding the airport, and what is now so commonplace for us, I can hardly get from point A to point B without immediately putting it in my smartphone and using Siri about giving us directions of where we are, where we want to go, the best course to follow and options, and giving us a sense of progress toward the goal. So that seems to be a fairly universal one that people like. When we think about progress monitoring, as we've been doing here, especially in the context of MTSS, we usually think about a general outcome measure or a long-term monitoring approach, not a mastery monitoring approach. So we have a sense of where we're starting, which oftentimes we think about as our baseline or starting point. We have an indication of where we want to be, which we usually have an indication of something that would indicate students being at low risk, students that may not need additional support. It could actually be a criterion reference of where we want students to be with a particular skill. And the point A to point B becomes our course to follow. The student progress over time becomes that feedback system so that we know when we're on track and when we're not. And just like with the GPS system, sometimes we hear the rerouting. Now, I always share that the voice that came in my box originally with my original GPS system actually sounded kind of gruff when I missed the exit or made the wrong turn. And I quickly found that Lee, being my Australian navigator, was much kinder to me and would say rerouting as if, you know what, it happened. Here, let me show you another way. And I liked him much better. And I always share that because I think that the rerouting part of progress monitoring, we need to treat it like that. We always make the best decisions we can with the information that we have at the time. And as we get humbled by learners, as we try and figure out the fit, we're going to have to make mid-course adjustments in order to find that right combination of what accelerates learning for this group or this individual student. So be thinking about what analogy works for you. So we've talked about MTSS as the context. We've talked about the why. And I want to go into a little bit around the what, because oftentimes questions will come up as people are putting together their system and they have questions about progress monitoring and progress monitoring systems. I'll often talk about MTSS as making sure that we do recognize a formal progress monitoring system, one that has that strong evidence base that we can get that feedback on over time, but also honoring and recognizing that there are ways that we monitor progress that may not be captured in a formal system. So my colleagues who do exit tickets to kind of get a sense of, hey, what worked for you today? Where are you still stuck? Give me, an indicator of how you're doing. Teachers that make observations of how students are interacting with materials, how they're responding to particular arrangements. I call those things monitoring of progress, and they have an important place in the system. But for MTSS, we also have to have more of that formalized system for giving us the feedback. And I've often said the cornerstone of MTSS is the use of evidence-based practices in order to create strong and healthy systems. So when there's choices that exist for progress monitoring, choose those with the strongest evidence base. If an evidence base does not exist, then make the best decisions you can with the information that you have. Monitor and adjust, monitor and adjust, monitor and adjust. So for a while, it really bothered me in the district that we didn't seem to have a really strong way to monitor progress for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. We were doing the best we could with some type of a portfolio arrangement, but we kept watching the research, and thank goodness for people like Renata Tika and her colleague Brian Avery, I hope I'm saying their names correctly, through the University of Minnesota. started to be able to publish work around general outcome measures for that population. So we kept our eye out, and as those things became evident, we were really grateful. I was just recently reading, let me see, work out of, I don't remember which university, but it was in the school mental health journal, all on MTSS, starting to demonstrate some of the technical adequacy around formative monitoring systems for areas that would be classified as internalizing issues around depression and anxiety. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is great. People are starting to study this. They're starting to put some research out there. So we make the decisions that we can with the information we have, and we keep monitoring it. In terms of the frequency, that's an often asked question. And the way that I think about it is as our concern increases, so too does our monitoring. And our monitoring increases not so that we have volumes of data, but so that we have data that we can make timely decisions about whether or not to keep the course or whether or not we need to make a change. So oftentimes we'll think about the progress monitoring for, say, grade or department or age levels as frequently as we might collect our universal data. So it might be fall, winter, and spring. It might be one time per month if we're looking at office discipline referrals. So whatever makes sense in terms of our universal supports, then that would be the frequency to get a health check. In terms of students receiving additional support, people will often think about their formalized systems of collecting data every other week or, depending upon the measure, sometimes once per month. Sometimes the publishers or the researchers for those measures may make different recommendations. So for example, the general outcome measures I was referencing for students with significant cognitive disabilities, the sensitivity of those measures to progress is such that they recommend doing that once a month. So go with the guidelines that are provided by the researchers or publishers. And for students receiving the most intensified support, we usually think about collecting data every day or every week, again, so that we get a really sensitive indication of whether or not we're on track or not on track. For the frequency piece, sometimes I think about it in terms of my health checks, right? Oftentimes, I see my doctor once a year, and she says, great, Dawn, you're looking good. We'll see you in a year at your next health check. I say, wonderful. If, however, something's giving us pause, she might say, you know what, I want to see you in 6 months as opposed to a year. We want to keep an eye on something. Or if I have a major concern and I'm in the hospital, they might be monitoring every morning and afternoon. Or if I'm in intensive care, they're monitoring every hour. So again, the frequency depends upon how timely we need those data and how high our concern is. So what's it look like in action? We know the context. We've talked a little bit about the why, talked a little bit about the what. How do we put it into motion? I wish I could say that the research supports the mere act of monitoring progress as being that which changes outcomes. But like I have found, I was recently telling someone I was doing this webinar, and I said, you know, I always think about it like, for me, losing weight, I wish just monitoring myself on that scale every day was going to be what made that number go down, but that's not the case. And I think about, for our field, that the way our system is set up to provide additional support and to monitor progress, we're not honoring the power of our work and our craft when we don't make sure that time is set aside to be able to reflect on it and be able to make really judicious decisions based upon what we're seeing. So when we think about, like, what does a routine look like, we usually break it down into 3 simple ways of thinking about it: organizing our information, processing our information, and acting on our information, or OPA for short. So I selected to show an individual student as an example here, but I could have shown a school level, I could have shown a grade level, I could have shown a group level, but I'm showing an individual student level. So the first part is organizing the information, and I see the information as being three parts. One is we have to have some sense of what is being done, right? What's that, however you want to term it, what's the targeted support that's being done? So in this case, the student is Suni. Suni is being provided with extra support in the area of fluency, and it looks like that support is being provided 3 days a week with six other students in a computer lab, and the intervention of choice is read naturally. So knowing what we're doing is the first part of organizing it. The second part is being able to have readily accessible our progress monitoring data so we can see, all right, how's Suni doing? And the third part that I don't have represented here, but I know would exist, is data that would come from the Read Naturally program itself. I might have a sense, how is Suni doing on her cold reads? How's she doing on her hot reads? What might she be writing in there about things that she remembers from her story? I might have some teacher observations about what the teacher is noticing when Suni is reading. What things is she doing really well? What things are really coming along? What things are not? We don't want these to end up being dissertations on Suni, but I think it's important to kind of organize and be able to succinctly share what it is we're seeing with our data and our observations. So we organize it. Our processing first becomes reviewing the plan. And when I say on here reviewing the plan, it's really asking the question, are we doing what we said we thought would make a difference for her? And we have to give room for people to say, you know what? I was supposed to be doing that, and that's not what's occurring. Because sometimes I've seen us go down the path of changing interventions when they weren't even receiving them for some reason to begin with. And our colleagues at the National Implementation Research Network have always said something that has stuck with me. Students can't benefit from supports that they're not receiving. So we have to first ask the question, is this plan being implemented? So we didn't find this out with Suni, but we may have found out, you know what, we were supposed to be doing that 3 days a week, but our computer lab for the last 2 weeks has been used in a different fashion, or half of the computers have been out and we haven't been able to do that. It allows the team to problem solve a different system level issue than trying to figure out what is working or not working about it for Suni. So we'll go with the fact that this was done as it was meant to be implemented with her. And so the processing becomes having the team talk about what do we see working and what's not working as well. So kind of getting in this brainstorm motion. And I really encourage teams to not evaluate everything that's said. Just put the thinking out there and kind of sit with what our observations are across the board. In some cases, if there's one person that's mainly with Suni and it's the teacher, I'm giving room for him or her to really think and to rest with that thinking and be able to say some things out loud without us jumping on that must be what the path we go down. Sometimes I'll ask these as reflection points. So do we see any part of her interaction, in this case with Read Naturally, that we see a skill mismatch? That we see Suni being frustrated? Or we see decreased engagement? Those three things seem to spark some really important observations. For example, if I were to ask if there was a skill mismatch, and I started to hear the teacher say, you know what? Now that you're saying that, we thought it was a fluency issue, but I'm hearing a lot of errors that she's making. Maybe we weren't correct. Maybe it was a phonics issue, or maybe it only happens with multisyllabic words, and that's what we need to focus on. And that's important because if we were to continue down the path of having Suni practice reading individually, 3 days a week for 20 minutes or 30 minutes at a time, and we found out that it was a phonics issue, we are going to have a hard time undoing that further on down the road. So that piece of, do we have a skill mismatch, is important. I'll turn to what this team actually started to reflect on. They started, and we used this as a prompting sheet. You're welcome to download it at swiftschools.org. I usually encourage districts, if they have their own instructional framework and some instructional strategies or priorities, I'll encourage them to create their own prompt sheet to work from. But in this case, we drew attention to think about the grouping, think about the instruction, think about feedback that's given, think about frequency and duration, just as something that might kind of get it off the ground, get the reflections off the ground. And in this case, they said, we've noticed Suni is really social. Maybe that might make us think about utilizing a peer in the process. When they were thinking about the changes to modeling or more opportunities to respond, they were like, maybe the practice component could be with a peer, maybe another adult in the building. When they got to the feedback piece, they started saying, maybe we should utilize a video so that Suni could hear herself reading and maybe be able to recognize the areas that she would want to work on with fluency. Maybe she's reading too slow or robotic or missing the expression that should come. And it looks like they pointed out that they may have missed a couple of Fridays, so they might actually be considering maybe another day for it. So we organize data and we process data and really figure out how to give prompts to get people to think about what's working, what's not, as opposed to all of a sudden switching gears with our intervention. And then the acting part is when a change is warranted and we brainstorm some ideas, turning to the person most closest to the student and or the student and parent themselves and saying, we've talked about a lot of different things. Have we hit on anything that you think might work? And a separate question from that is that manageable, what you think will work, and what supports do you need? And I really like separating out the what do you think will work from the is it manageable? Because I don't want people to select something that is manageable that they really don't have confidence in it working. So I want to hear, what do you think the Cadillac version here is for Suni? And if it's not manageable, talk a little bit more about what you think will work so that maybe we can figure out how to get closer to a Cadillac model, how to get closer to something that's a really good fit and it gives us confidence will work for them. And then that last question of asking what supports are needed to pull this off, I think are really making sure that we make this system as much about how we support each other as it is about how we individually work to support students. So asking that question and really encouraging people to say, wow, I really like this idea of utilizing the video, but I have no idea, like, can our computers even do that? Like, is that possible? And exploring, figuring out, what do we need? Who can we lean on to set that up? Is that something that could be done? Can Suni do it herself? What does that look like? I don't want someone to disband it because they think that they have to carry the weight of all of the changes themselves. So organize, process, and act carefully with support. We then indicate that on our graph so that we start to demonstrate, here's what we're learning every time we make a change, trying to find the right fit for this student to achieve the outcomes that they want. So all of that to say, how do you put that in an elevator speech, right? I know we're never going to be on the elevator where we're really probably talking about progress monitoring, but let's say we were at the district office and let's say that someone came in and said, where are you going? And we're going to a progress monitoring training and they say, what's that about? We'd want to be able to say something like, well, I'll tell you, I know right now in our district, we're really working on a multi-tiered system of support, and progress monitoring for us is going to be monitoring how kids are doing at all of our grade levels at our school. We're going to be monitoring groups of kids, and I'm going to be monitoring kids that are receiving support in my class, so I know when to make a change and when not to make a change. And that's really important for me because that gives me the feedback almost like a GPS does as I was getting here. I knew when I was on course, I knew when I was not on course. And the good news about it is that it's worth my time because the research has really demonstrated strong effect in doing that. And the great news is that we have time as a team to be able to process with each other and lean on each other for ideas when we're not on track. What are other ideas that we can do? Because we're all about kids being successful in our district. Ding, elevator's off. And I have to tell you, I've given that elevator speech a dozen times and it's different every time. It's not that it's robotic, it's that you can kind of put these pieces together in a way that can be within a minute and a half. And it's not we progress monitor because we're supposed to progress monitor. So with that, I will stop and ask Rachel if there's any questions or other people sharing in the chat box that I can't see.
Dawn, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation, and we do, in fact, have some questions to put before you. And I'd like to remind everyone that if you would like to submit a question, please go ahead and type it into the GoToWebinar Control Panel section that says questions. And we will put as many of those to Dawn as we can with our time. And so our first question today is, what about progress monitoring students with IEPs? Can the same procedures be used?
Great, good. I'm glad people asked that question. Oftentimes with students that have IEPs, progress monitoring has kind of been what we've been about for a long time. With a multi-tiered system of support, I highly encourage people to think about that system as not being a different system for students with IEPs. So while teams may have different things that may or may not be exactly the same measures, oftentimes they will. Oftentimes students that maybe need support likely are in the support of literacy or math or behavior. And so we want that to be connected to the same system that their classmates are. Now, that said, oftentimes people ask the question, what about students who, quote unquote, aren't on grade level? Are you monitoring with the same level material? So a fourth grader who might be receiving early literacy support, would we be monitoring with fourth grade materials? My course of action has often been for the benchmark assessments 3 times a year. I encourage people to do that at grade level. I want my N to be as close to 100% with those measures as possible. For students that are at the fourth grade level and we're providing early literacy support, we will likely be progress monitoring off grade level because we want something sensitive to giving us feedback about when to stay the course and when not to. And if we monitored them on grade level, it'd be saying change, 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 when in fact, those passages just aren't sensitive enough to the types of skills that we're working on. So that's why when you look at a suite of assessments that are available, you may be progress monitoring off grade level when you're doing it more frequently. I hope that's kind of what that question was about.
Oh, definitely. Thank you. That was excellent. You touched briefly about looking at progress data, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how frequently we should be looking at progress data after we collect it.
Yeah, good. So in terms of systems that are set up, I'm a real fan of making sure that master calendars are built so that teams can look at data either monthly, depending. So like at the secondary level, oftentimes people who are using an early warning system that are looking at attendance and um, progress monitoring grades, things like that, they may be looking at that monthly to make sure that they're seeing, what are they seeing with attendance, what are they seeing with grades, what's on our radar. At the elementary level, in areas like literacy and math, they usually put on there at least 3 times a year to formally have those data conversations. And then often I find that grade levels will likely have monthly meetings where they can talk about grade level progress as well as groups of students. For individual students, I think that's a team decision as to when should we reconvene to have a sense of whether or not we need to formally make a change. And so sometimes people will say, you know what, we're going to set this up to talk about it next month or in 6 weeks, unless we have a clear indication that we're not going in the right direction. And then we'll set that meeting up sooner if need be.
Great, thank you very much.
Sure.
Next question is, do you have resources for progress monitoring in Spanish, and will this work in the same way?
Oh, good question. If students are learning their literacy is in Spanish, I know that, and I don't know where they reside now, but I do know that there were measures called EDEL. And don't ask me to tell you what the acronym stands for. But the EDEL measures I know for students learning to read in Spanish, and I believe in Korean. And Rachel, I'm not sure about FAST. Are FAST measures in other languages?
Yes. Yes, in fact, we don't have too many, but we do have Spanish language assessments in the areas of early reading and CBM reading. And so if folks are interested in our Spanish measures, we definitely have those.
Wonderful, great. That's usually the most common one people are looking for. Yeah. And so do they work in the same way? That would be articulated by the researchers to be looking to see if the areas of the frequency of the assessment, how the progress monitoring is set up, is the same. My guess would be is that it would likely fall in a very similar ballpark to the fashion that are being used in English.
Yes, and that's certainly the true for the FAST Spanish assessments. Ours are as close as possible in terms of the procedural format and standardization to the English. However, they were constructed entirely from scratch by a team of researchers who are fluent in Spanish and researchers in English language development. And so content's different, but everything else follows a lot of the same procedures.
Great. I know that this, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I know that this is about progress monitoring, but I love that you share that those are available, because I know one of the things that we struggled with for a while were students that were coming to us, and we really leaned on those measures if it was their first language or a language that they had been taught literacy skills in, because it gave us a really nice profile of these are strengths as they were learning literacy in Spanish. And it was helpful because sometimes our measures in English, it was kind of like, well, yes, because we're learning a new language and we're learning literacy skills in that language too. So I loved being able to kind of know what those strengths were in a first or common language experience that they had. So thanks for telling people about that.
Absolutely, yes. Here's another language-based question. What types of assessments can you use to monitor reading skills?
What types of assessments?
Yes, I mean, it sounds like you're very familiar with a range of different assessment tools. And so when it comes to progress monitoring kids who are getting support in reading, what types of assessments do you typically see used?
Gotcha. Okay, great. Usually I encourage districts or sites to make kind of a map of what data they would have available. so that they could say, I think what the examples I was showing were all like an oral reading fluency, which is a general outcome measure, but we may have a student that needs support in the area of phonological awareness. So we may be monitoring more of a phonological awareness indicator. We may be honing in on something that would be more linked to a particular phonics focus. So depending upon the areas, then there would be different indicators that would be available. I wish I would have shown a couple of different ones. And Rachel, I can't remember last time we did a webinar together. You shared with me some of the, and I can't remember what the report was called, but there was one that showed different indicators for early literacy. Can you name some of those? Because I know I won't get the name right.
Oh, sure. There are definitely a variety out there. Certainly the research team that, pioneered this work was the Dibbles team, and those are now available from both the University of Oregon as well as a new company called Acadian Learning. And then Fastbridge Learning also has its own set of early reading assessments. Ours are called, conveniently enough, early reading. And we have those both in English and in Spanish. And they're really targeted at students in kindergarten and first grade. And then there are also some measures available both through the INCLUB system and the Easy CBM system. Those have undergone some changes recently, and I'm not as familiar with them in their current formations. But there are a variety of different early reading assessments out there. And the key is these are tools that are going to break down the subskills of early reading into increments where teachers would be able to design instruction. And that's really the key piece, so that the teachers will know exactly what aspect of early reading does the student need to work on.
Yeah, great. So see, I was going further in the weeds than you were. So that's a really important piece to be able to see what are parts of the suites of assessment, if any one of those systems, so that you would know what you have access to for progress monitoring in different areas.
Exactly. And the Fastbridge one includes 13 different subtests in English, 12 in Spanish, and they're going to cover all of the skill areas that we know are essential for early reading development, so phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency. And there are multiple measures for each of those different subskills.
Gotcha.
Next question actually shifts over to some personnel. Who are the best staff members to conduct progress monitoring?
That is a really good question, and one that always poses really good conversation. My experience is that oftentimes people start with a group that wants to try it out. I will tell you that I loved to help out with the progress monitoring because I dig data, and so I loved to do it. What I found out very quickly was I really needed to shift the support I was providing, because I truly feel that the classroom teacher is the best person to do the progress monitoring. Now, that said, a classroom teacher with 27 students and thinking about needing to do possibly weekly monitoring might just be enough to kind of tip the cup. So we have to think differently about how can I provide support when centers are going on, or how can I provide support differently while kids are engaged in discussion or while they might be doing something, and helping people think creatively that progress monitoring of, say, 5 students doesn't all have to be at the same time on the same day. It might be grabbing 2 minutes every day to be able to progress monitor one student. So I say that because I think that the person closest to being the primary provider, it gives them that one-on-one time to hear that student and hear them flying solo and really kind of putting these pieces together. But we also want to make sure that we don't overload without making sure that people are supported in doing it. So that's my preference, and I'll stick to it. But we also can't just, this is the way you should do it. And all of a sudden that means that my best friend, who's a first grade teacher and was a kindergarten teacher and had 34 kindergartners, that would have pretty much put her over the edge if I would have said, yeah, but Terry, you're the best person to do the progress monitoring. So we got to make it realistic.
Yes, I think, that's an absolute good advice, is that it has to be doable or probably not going to happen. Yes. We just got another question in that I think I can answer, and then we have a couple more to put to Dawn before we finish. Can we get a list of the progress monitoring tools for reading and math by email? Yes, I think certainly we could provide you with the ones that Southbridge publishes, and we'll make sure to have that be available to you. Next question is, what if we don't have good interventions at our school? How can we find them?
Wow, that's important to know when you don't have them, because then your progress monitoring is going to be like, oh my gosh, we know what we need to do, right? I think that there's a number of places that you can look. One of them would be the What Works Clearinghouse, which is a real go-to with a high standard around evidence-based practices. I believe you should also still be able to find a link on the swiftschools.org website. And I'll give that, if Rachel, you're going to be sending something out, I'll give people a direct link. So I'd encourage you to go and browse around. We got good stuff on there, but it's through multiple clicks that you would find it. So I'll see if I can provide you with a direct link to another source. And I would think about making sure that you have a really nice range of things to pick from so that you can make good matches. And then always think about just that really good instructional cycle of the I do, we do, you do, and be able to break down, what is this a student who needs more modeling in this particular reading strategy? Is this student who has the strategy but needs more practice in getting it to a real fluent level? Or is this a student who knows how to do it when it looks like this, but really needs to be able to practice generalizing that skill? And I think sometimes in our efforts to select some really good evidence-based programs, that sometimes we overlook the evidence base behind an instructional cycle that can help us make some good matches.
Absolutely. Well said. And then final question, what advice do you have if we are just getting started with progress monitoring?
I would say to just start doing it. Just start with that simple thing of what's our baseline? What do we have as an indicator of success? And start monitoring and give yourself grace to think. Think about what it's telling you. Think about what it's meaning to you. Because I think that when people have that visual in front of them and we're on track, it's a nice positive celebration that sometimes we don't give ourselves space to do and say, look at that. This is great. We found a key for this kiddo. As well as when they're not on track, not to get frustrated and beat ourselves up, but be able to bring a couple of colleagues together to say, can I talk about what I'm seeing with this student? Here's what I know is working. Here's what I'm seeing not working. Can you be thought partners with me in thinking about something to change? But having people hear you out, as opposed to thinking that Donovan's not making progress, what do I do? And there's like this easy silver bullet of you just do this. So I'd say try it out, start doing it, and invite others in to be part of hearing you and thinking about what to change up.
Excellent advice. So thank you very much, Dawn, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. This session was recorded, and you'll receive an email to let you know when the recording is available. We invite you to subscribe to the FAST Insights weekly blog, which includes additional resources about today's topic. And you can also follow FastSearch Learning on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you all for attending, and have a wonderful afternoon.